Welcome to Carbon Clarity, the podcast for the carbon curious. I'm your host, Kev Cooling, founder and MD of Hut22, and today I'm really excited to be joined by Anna Dowson, Senior Director of Sustainability at Greenscale. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Kev. Thank
How
you
are
so
you
much for
doing?
having me.
Oh, thanks so
Yeah.
much for coming on. Thanks so much for coming on. So you doing okay?
Yes. Oh, we've had such beautiful weather recently. I'm not
I
sure
know,
if that
I
relevant,
know.
but loving it.
I mean, spring is starting strong. Let's see if it can keep, if we can keep it up. Fingers
That would
crossed.
be good, wouldn't it?
um, Well, thank you for coming on. As I say, today we're going to talk about the stuff that Greenscale does, which is data centers. But before we get into that, what would be great is to hear a little bit about your career to date. How have you got to where you are now?
Absolutely. It's been, I'd say, quite a journey. So I studied architecture and environmental design, which was oddly an engineering degree, despite the name, at Nottingham University. And after those 4 years of simultaneously studying architecture and engineering, I decided that my mind was definitely wired to be an engineer. So I went to work for an engineering design consultancy. And that was around the time when the 2008 recession hit. And being in kind of the real estate construction industry wasn't necessarily the safest place to be. So it felt at the time. And an opportunity came about to go, say, back into academia and do some research. So there's a part industry, part academia type research. It's called an engineering doctorate, bit different to a PhD. And I took that opportunity and spent 4 years researching energy efficiency in buildings and the discrepancies between design and operational energy use. And that's where we met, right, Kev,
Yeah,
throughout those 4 years.
that's it.
When I was at AECOM, so the doctorate was sponsored by AECOM, and it was a really exciting time. It was time where the industry was just about kind of getting their head around that predictions or estimates of energy use weren't really suitable for determining or estimating operational energy use. And we kept calling it the performance gap or design performance gap. So at the end of those 4 years, I got approached by one of the biggest supermarket in the country, so Tesco, with
Hmm.
an opportunity to join their energy team. And it was a really interesting opportunity, having come from design and then doing the design performance gap and then going into operations. And it was such a fantastic move. Tesco consumed just under 1% of the electricity in the country. So much opportunity to really get stuck in and deliver
Yeah.
some tangible carbon savings. So I was at Tesco for just under 10 years, 9 and a bit years, and eventually got promoted to their head of energy. So everything to do with energy consumption, optimization, insights, analytics, renewable, transition into renewables, electrification of delivery vans, providing EV charging for customers, and then trying to decarbonize heat, or the electrification of everything, as I like to call it, would be part of the remit of the team I used to manage. And so, yeah, 9 and a bit years later, after having had two kids and two small tranches of mat leave, it felt like it was the time to maybe take on a different challenge. And I got a random call about a role in data centers. And I remember thinking, I've never been inside a data center. You're calling the right Anna. But
They all look the same. Don't worry.
they all look
Once
the
you've been in
same.
one, you've been in all of them. Maybe not.
True. Oh, yeah. To be honest, not entirely true. Not entirely
Yeah.
true. But it felt like such an exciting opportunity. I was ready to move into a new sector, having spent so much time in food retail. And I was also really keen to kind of broaden. I had come from a sustainability and environmental background, and then I had spent so much time looking purely at energy. I was keen to kind of go back into broader environmental, or even more broadly into ESG or sustainability.
Hmm.
So this opportunity ticked both boxes, new sector and broadening of the scope. So I took the plunge. I helped I set up CBRE's ESG service offering for their data center solutions business,
Okay.
which was a really exciting challenge, kind of building something from scratch, started growing the team, to start delivering those services. And then the opportunity to join Greenscale came about,
Mm.
and it felt too exciting not to give it a go. And I was appointed before we even launched as a company to the market. So
Oh,
it
wow.
just showed the commitment. Yeah, absolutely. From the exec to, have someone in before they even launch to look
Yeah,
after sustainability and shape the vision. So that's been 4 or 5 months now. So still early on in the journey, but so excited to be here.
brilliant. Well, that's great. It's really interesting, as you say, that even before the company got off the ground, they're appointing somebody to head up sustainability, which is fantastic. That shows a lot of forward
Absolutely.
thinking, which is great. Okay, so we mentioned data centers a lot. Obviously, that's kind of what you're doing these days. And it may well be the case that some of the people listening don't really understand what a data center is and how important they are actually to our everyday lives now. We pick up our phones, pick up our laptops, pick up our tablets, we turn on TV to stream a movie. Everything we do, go online, do some shopping, whatever it is, it pretty much all goes through data centers, right? So maybe just for the benefit of anybody who perhaps isn't so familiar with that, what
Mhm.
are data centers?
Yeah, absolutely. So they are essentially buildings or infrastructure that house computing, networking equipment, and essentially all of that kit either stores, processes, or distributes data. So simplistically, and as very much like as you alluded to, Kev, it is the backbone of the internet and the modern digital age. So everything you do on your like mobile banking transactions, if you invest on stock exchange and shares, for example, all of the cloud computing. So as we migrate more and more documents and how we work on pretty much everything's on the cloud these days, isn't it? Either through your personal life or your professional life.
Pretty much everything, isn't it? I mean, I remember looking at some research a long, long time ago, and I don't know there's ever been any more done about the impact of kind of every email that you send. And it feels like there's no impact to that, doesn't it? You send an email, there's nothing physical, there's no paper, there's no waste, there's nobody driving in a van to go and deliver it. And yet there is still something going on behind the scenes, under the hood. There's energy being used to kind of move that data from one place to another.
Absolutely. And I remember the time when people would put in their signature, like, save the planet, don't print this email. We should probably put a save the planet, don't send unnecessary emails.
Yeah, right,
I don't know,
right.
maybe.
And my God, aren't they the bane of our lives? Such a double-edged sword. So
Yeah,
quick
it
to send and to get responses. Brilliant. So, I mean, they are absolutely essential, aren't they, to everything we do every day. You'd be pretty hard pressed, I reckon, to find almost anybody in the UK at least that doesn't rely on a data center daily.
Absolutely.
Um, and that point about energy is really important, isn't it? The last podcast that went out I was chatting to Nigel Banks from Octopus Energy, and he was talking about some of the challenges in the UK electricity infrastructure, and then being a problem to bringing on renewables to thing. And I presume there's the same sort of constraints for data centers. If they use loads and loads of energy, I guess that is those are real hotspots for the UK grid. Is that a constraint to development?
Absolutely. It is by far the biggest constraints at the
Mm,
moment. Last week, I had the pleasure of being out in Brussels in an ESG conference specifically for data centers, the ESG conference specifically for data centers.
mm.
And it is the only thing people talk about. It's trying to access power. Obviously, fiber and the connectivity element is also important. So there's no point having power if you don't have the cables to transmit that data
Right,
to where it needs to
right.
go or from. But power is by far the biggest bottleneck. And I think, and I know we're going to talk about AI later, I'm sure we will, but with the growth of AI, we're now seeing bigger and bigger deployments of data centers. So it is not uncommon to hear most data centers coming off the ground these days are 100 megawatt plus. And we're now seeing some of the hyperscalers of Google, the Metas of the world, talking about gigawatt sized facilities.
Mm.
So these things are monstrous.
To gives people a sense of that scale. I mean, one data center, is that equivalent to, like, a small town or something,
Oh,
or
it can easily, yeah,
yeah,
it could easily be, yeah. And
in
data
in
centers
one building.
already, yeah,
Mm,
yeah. Well, based on current estimates, data centers already consume about 3% of the electricity globally. And the
mm.
expectation is that would at least double by 2030, at least. So,
I mean, that's so significant. You just think it's like the heavy industry of our age, isn't it? Okay, we're
oh
not
yeah,
smelting iron or whatever, but nonetheless, they're,
absolutely.
they're equivalent in terms of their energy consumption. Absolutely. In Brussels, is it true that this is a constraint everywhere in the world then? This isn't just in the UK. This is everywhere.
It is not necessarily a constraint everywhere. We're seeing a lot in terms of power, availability of power. We're
Yeah.
seeing a lot of data center deployments in the Nordics, where we see a bigger abundance of especially renewable power, be it hydro, be it
Mm.
geothermal in Iceland. But then you tend to run into the constraints around fiber and the cables that need to transmit the data, not just the power. And
Mm.
so again, for people that are not familiar with the data center sector, we tend to talk a lot about the FLAP-D market, which is Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris. D is Dublin. So they are the five biggest capitals, let's say, where you have the biggest convergence of data centers. And that tends to be around where you have the big financial centers and you have the concept of latency, which is the time it takes for that data to ping to a data center and back, let's say. So kind of challenging the status quo and challenging what data centers and what activities that happen in data centers have such a latency dependency, let's say, is really important because we're seeing workloads shift to the Nordics, where one, there's more availability of renewable energy, but we have more abundant free cooling opportunities, right? So they're
Yeah.
perfect places. But if you need, let's say, your Netflix film to kind of load within a millisecond, and if not, you're going to get frustrated and lose a customer, then
Mm.
you can't afford to send and host your Netflix, library in Iceland, or more importantly, financial transactions or what we call very, very latency dependent activities. So, for example, for driverless cars, where you need to be able to react incredibly fast, you cannot have long latency. You need then to have edge data centers, which are located really, really close to where you need that data.
So this is something I didn't think we'd talk about, but driverless cars. So that computing isn't all done on board the driverless car. So that
It needs to be triangulating
yeah,
or
yeah,
more than that. It needs, and yeah, smart cities. Even I think how traffic lights and things are coordinated more, intelligently, or smart motorways and things like that will require on some edge computing. I think, but certainly driverless cars, you need the edge computing and the edge data centers.
yeah. And it feels like there are so many. Well, we know that technology and digitization and AI and everything is going to be all pervasive. It's going to be everywhere, isn't it? It's going to be affecting whether we like it or not, kind of every part of what we do. So more and more, the infrastructure that sits behind that, i.e., the data centers and all the cables and the power requirements, everything else, is just going to be. It's only going one way, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so given then that it is a constraint for us, particularly in the UK, what does that mean? Are we able to meet that demand? Is there a plan in place to kind of do something about that? Is it an opportunity that we're missing?
No, there is a lot that could be done, but just because of the volume, it is
Mm,
even you say, oh, let's put PV on the roof, and these facilities are usually really big, right? But you can fill your entire roof with PV, and at best you'll get a couple of percent of
yeah,
your total electricity consumption, right? It doesn't really shift the dial. There's a lot that can be done in terms of improving the efficiency of like, the ancillary or the equipment that's there to essentially to cool and power, make sure that your IT is still being powered. Might have heard the term PUE, which is power use effectiveness.
hmm,
And what it does, it measures the total energy consumption to run your facility and then how much of it goes to just power your IT. So your IT is, let's say, the one. And let's say you've got a PUE at 1.5, the point 0.5 is all the other stuff that's required to keep your IT cool and
yeah.
working in order. So the lower your PUE, the more efficient your facility is in terms of the ancillaries. And we've
And it's a
seen
metric. It's a
PUE
metric that people talk about a lot, isn't it, in data centers? And kind
a
of in
lot.
order to kind of say, let's say you're a responsible business and you want to kind of, you need some cloud computing, and you want to be responsible in the way you do that. You might well use the PUE of a data center to decide where to host that stuff
Yeah.
because it's a
And
measure of efficiency.
absolutely. But it is flawed to a certain
Yeah.
extent.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I think that the key there is, well, firstly, as with any metric, you need to have the robustness of how you're measuring the data and how you're calculating it. There is an ISO standard for, or an EN standard for. And then we've reduction in average PUE over the years, but this plateaued around 5 odd years ago. Kind of plateaued at around the 1.5, which isn't great. We're seeing new facilities, as in on average across the whole industry, but we're seeing new facilities hit 1.2 and lower, which is certainly the direction of travel we want. And the EU has launched, as part of the EU Energy Efficiency Directive, which has been around for donkey's years, for over a decade, the latest recast, they finally acknowledge that data centers are power hungry monsters.
Right.
Did I say that? Yeah. So they have actually put provision in place, and there's a particular article that deals with data centers where, to start off with, they're purely collating data on things like PUE, WE, which is the equivalent for water, and other elements like heat reuse, etc. To start off with, it's purely a data collection, which will then inform benchmarks, or at least the baseline of which they'll then be able to put minimum performance standards again, and then each country can do it slightly differently. Germany has gone ahead and already put minimum performance standards, PUE being a key one. But going back to like the flawed nature of the PUE is that it completely negates, let's say, the IT load, which is the biggest source of electricity consumption, right? And there is undoubtedly, and I'm not an IT expert, I'm not going to kind of say how you can reduce the one, but you can usually reduce the one. There will be inefficiencies on how the servers are being run, and a lot of them are usually in idle mode or out of my area of expertise, but there's more often than not opportunity to reduce the one, but the PUE doesn't.
Yeah.
So
the kind of the implicit thing there, I guess, then is that if you've got a data center with a PUE of 1.2 and a data center with a PUE of 1.5, it may be actually that the 1.5 is better because the one is better to start with.
It could be,
because it's about it's a ratio, isn't it? Is it about a ratio of the amount of energy used for the IT kit versus the amount of energy used to keep it cool?
It is. Yeah. So I think the nut of it is that the PUE is looking at all of the building services that are there to keep the IT running, which for people that work in building services and work in kind of from the background that we come from, it's a great measure because it's telling you, is your chiller the right chiller running efficiently, or is your UPS optimized for the site, etc. But we tend to have this segregation of the IT people look after the IT, or as we say in data centers, the white space, which is the data halls that hold the servers, etc. And then, the building service engineers or, mechanical, electrical people will then be looking after everything that keeps it running and protects it and make sure that it's got the power that it needs and it's cooled. So the PUE metric is good for optimizing everything else, but it fails to look at the IT, which is the star that runs the show.
In those data halls. And for anybody who hasn't been in one, it's like, those movies you've seen where Tom Cruise goes into somewhere to steal some data and he just conveniently plugs a little thing into a big tall black cabinet and lights flash and he's suddenly got the data. I mean, I'd love to have one of those things. Anyway, that's what it's like, right? Rows and rows of those cabinets of like boxes whirring away and with little lights flashing and stuff.
Absolutely. And there is a lot. So I think it's just as some examples. So like nowadays you go into certainly modern data centers, they'll either have a cold aisle containment or a hot aisle containment, which is to essentially keep the hot and the cold air away from each other. And there's a lot, looking at the positive side of AI, there's a lot of technology out there available that uses AI to optimize the airflow. So it's essentially about, making sure that hot air and cold air aren't mixing with each other and potentially detecting hotspots before they become an issue. So there's a lot of really good AI tools out there that help run data centers more energy efficiently.
So if PUE isn't really the right number, it's the number we use at the moment, but is there a different metric that we should be using?
Oh, saying the royal we, the industry's been around the houses with this. I think everyone has an issue with PUE, but no one's ever been able to find something better.
Right.
There's been a lot of proposals out there, and I think the key is that you shouldn't rely on a single metric, right? And you'll see the same in other sectors, like using a kilowatt hour per square foot, or it's very rare that you'll find one metric that's all encompassing and that gives you a true picture. And I think that it's got to be part of how we measure and evaluate efficiency of data centers, but it shouldn't be the only one.
Yeah, because I guess irrespective of how efficient the IT kit is, we also always need the cooling stuff and everything else that's
Yes,
going on around it to be efficient too. So it does make sense to
absolutely.
use it, I suppose, doesn't
Yeah.
it? So you mentioned the fact that they're normally kind of big square boxes with a flat roof and then a stack load of chillers sat outside somewhere. Not normally on the roof, I don't think, unless there's a real space constraint because they're pretty
So,
heavy.
yeah.
But you could put PV on the roof and it would only do a couple of percent. So is there a role for renewables to be integrated into those data center sites, or maybe co-located with larger scale renewables? Maybe that's the way.
The latter, in my opinion. So you're seeing, and again, this is a data center jargony thing, but we tend to refer to the hyperscalers being we called Meta, Google, Amazon,
Yeah,
the big users of data centers. We call them the
they're the
hyperscalers.
hyperscalers. Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
which is
Now
something
we
I
know what
never
they're called.
understood before I started. So the hyperscalers are undoubtedly some of the most ambitious companies out there in terms of their renewable energy commitments, and they really are shifting the dial in terms of the volumes that they are procuring through mainly corporate PPAs
So
and
there's a power purchase agreements for
power
people
purchase
who
agreements.
aren't
Yeah,
in that
yeah,
market. Yeah.
exactly. But the sleeved kind rather than usually the on-site or private wire type agreements. And
Do you want to just quickly, for people who don't understand
yeah,
sleeved,
yeah,
just
yeah,
maybe let them
yeah.
know what that is?
So a corporate PPA or a sleeve PPA will be where, let's say, I've got a data center in London and I've gone and entered into an agreement with a wind farm developer in Scotland.
Yeah,
And by entering into a 15, 20-year deal with that developer, that gives them the financial certainty that they can go and invest and build
yeah,
that wind turbine. And I will be buying all or some of the power from that wind farm over that 15, 20-year, however long period of time. But to get that power from A to B, or to get, it won't be the exact same electrons, but
right.
what we'll essentially be doing is sleeving, so using the national grid to get the power from A to B. So it won't be the same electrons, but what we're saying is that wind farm in Scotland will be connected to the national grid, and I will still be needing the national grid to get that electricity
Yeah,
or any electricity into my site. It's in my opinion, corporate PPAs are a great vehicle for creating additionality and enabling developers to put money on new renewable energy developments without the need for financial incentives or tax incentives from the government. But you are seeing kind of that point of inflection where the national grid just can't deal. So the transmission lines can't deal, and then you get problems with curtailment where wind farms that need to be paid by the grid to not generate because they can't
yeah,
deal, can't transfer
yeah, yeah,
the electrons from A to B, right? So I think it's an important piece of the puzzle. But unlike a private wire agreement or an on-site agreement where you're essentially generating electricity and having a physical cable linking that into your site, then to a certain extent, you can bypass some of those national grid constraints, but you might then create others, which is the nature of the world, right? But I think, to your point, the ability to co-locate with energy generation, and you're unlikely to ever really see full island mode data center or data center that's completely off the grid because of the nature of the intermittency of renewables, unless you have a gas turbine on your site,
yeah,
and it would
yeah.
need to be a massive thing, right? Then I think you still need to rely on the local grid. But it's shall we go there? There is a lot of momentum and a lot of talk now in data centers around micronuclear.
Do you
Uh,
know, when you were talking earlier, I was thinking to myself, if I was Tony Stark, I'd be selling those tiny little reactors that he has in his chest to every data
yeah,
center because I'm thinking that's got to be the way, right?
yeah, they're not that tiny. They're micro, but they're not that
Right.
tiny.
I
But
mean,
they're
I'm
modular.
not
Yeah,
actually suggesting I'm in an Iron Man suit in every data center, but you get the picture.
absolutely. But there are a couple of companies out there developing and already deploying micronuclear, so they're modular. So in a way, you can take one module out, refuel, and put another one back in. So you could that is one of the only versions of the truth where I see a data center being able to be truly off grid is with
Mm.
technology like that. But we in data centers say we have a bit of a PR problem in data centers, in that everyone sees us at these power hungry, land hungry, water hungry
Mm.
warehouses. The nuclear
It
sector
might just
also
be
has
that
a
might just be
PR
the thing that
problem.
the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? Okay, fair enough.
PR issue together. How are we ever going to get this off the ground? But I think there's legs. That could be a whole other podcast on
Right,
whether small nuclear
right.
is going to go anywhere. Maybe not with me.
Okay,
Maybe with someone who's an expert on nuclear.
okay. I'll look somebody up. So,
I can give you some contacts.
thanks. So one of the things that Nigel Banks talked about the other week, which was really interesting, I thought, was when we're reporting on carbon emissions, when corporates reporting on carbon emissions on their carbon footprint, they tend to use a national average emissions factor, generally speaking. But what that doesn't do is it doesn't reflect the fact that actually the energy generated in, say, Scotland or close to a large offshore wind farm or something is actually much less carbon intense than, say, something generated on the M4 corridor, for example.
Yep.
So there is a consultation out apparently on moving to a more regional based approach, which means that data would be much more readily accessible. Incidentally, it is accessible already, but people generally don't tend to use it for reporting. But that would suggest that actually, in that case, should build data centers when that comes about. Hopefully, it will. Data centers up in Scotland, on the coast of Scotland, or wherever. And in fact, the government kind of recognised that in their action plan, their AI action plan. But what about that? Where are your data centers located?
So we have two sites at the moment that we're developing. We're Ariba Stage 2. One is in Northern Ireland,
Oh, okay.
which is an interesting, to me, it's that let's really kick the tires. It's so important to kind of think outside of the box. But Dublin is one of those hubs I mentioned as part of
Mm.
FLAPD, and it was one of the first cities that said, nope, there's an embargo on power. Don't even ask for power for data centers. We're not giving it. Been like that for a while. And I mean, Northern Ireland is just across a border, right?
Yeah.
Where our site is located, you have access straight to a subsea cable from the US. So in terms of that latency
Hmm.
I was talking
Hmm.
about, not an issue. And it's that little bit further north that you can get lovely Atlantic wind, and you've got the ability to use free cooling, right? So it's just anyone in data centers, they go like, oh, where's your site? Ireland. Oh, Dublin. No, Northern Ireland. Really?
Yeah.
But it's
Intriguing.
that, to me, it's one of the things we need to be doing more as a sector. And not surprisingly, the other side is in the Nordics, as I mentioned, abundance of
Mm.
renewable energy and the ability for free cooling. But it's the beginning of the journey for us, and we've got a big pipeline of potential sites, and these are the first two.
Brilliant. So and in terms of that kind of more general sustainability and maybe ESG as well, that issue of distributing wealth around the place a little bit, actually building data centers in those slightly more remote areas probably is not a bad shout, is it?
No.
Okay, so we've mentioned it quite a few times already. Let's talk about AI. So, it is pretty much everywhere. I'm constantly being bombarded actually through social media and stuff about, using AI to make my business faster and smarter and do things I couldn't do before and whatever. And people are appointing heads of AI, they're trying to embrace it. But you also hear things like an AI search uses 10 times more energy than a normal Google search. Can you tell us, is that true? Is it not true? I don't know if you
Yes,
know.
it is, because AI workloads tend to be run by high density computing GPUs, graphic processing units, and they
Uh-huh.
are just that much more power hungry. They are so power hungry that they're changing the way we need to cool our data centers. So with that kind of higher density power consumption, you can't just cool your data centers with air anymore like you
Mm.
would historically. So
Yep.
there's a bunch of new exciting technologies for cooling data centers that are coming out as a result, and there'll be immersion cooling or liquid cooling
Mm.
and direct-to-chip cooling. It's lots of really cool fandangled new cooling
Right.
alternative cooling technologies, which to me is great to a certain extent. Not so great that these things are that these AI computers, let's say we call it simplistically, consume that much more energy. But it is challenging our way of cooling data centers and improving the efficiency. So with these technologies I mentioned before, the opportunity to reduce the PUE is massive. And one of the things that excites me, and this is very much glass half full thinking,
Okay, we like that.
with these technologies that I talked about, cooling technologies, you have the opportunity to get higher grade heat at the end of the process.
Yeah.
And what that unlocks is the opportunity for heat reuse off the back of data centers. So one of the things we haven't talked about is data centers produce an enormous amount of waste heat. And in the conference I was last week, one of the moderators were like, people keep saying data centers are not efficient. We are incredibly efficient at turning electricity into heat. Like,
Yeah, right,
spot on.
that is definitely true. So just for those, again for people, so when we talk about waste heat, a high grade heat means it's at a higher temperature, right? So
It's
and
at a
of course
higher
the
temperature,
higher
yeah.
the temperature of the heat that's effectively just being thrown away because you're using all this energy to try and cool it and get rid of it, actually could potentially be useful for something.
Absolutely, like connecting to a district heating network or heating a local swimming pool, which is the example the industry loves banging on about. So, in Paris during the Olympics, there was a data center that heated up the Olympic swimming pool, it's a great example,
It's a great example, yeah.
And there's a local community swimming pool somewhere in the UK that was heated by a data center as well. But it's a great, but then it's back to like, you might locate these data centers out in the middle of nowhere, and then there's just nothing else nearby to use the heat, right? But we should at
There's
least
definitely
try.
a
And that's
balance.
part of, yeah. And the EU directive I mentioned has a requirement. Certainly, the way it's been transposed in Germany is that there is a requirement to make that heat readily available. You can't force the data center to, create a district heating network,
Yeah.
but to make that heat available and have the tap off points ready to connect to should that opportunity come about.
That's really interesting, because there are lots of examples of local authorities. Bristol is a good example. If you're developing in the city centre, you need to make sure your building is ready to connect to a district heating network, even though it's not there yet, and they're planning it in the future. But it's really interesting that actually sources of heat are also being made in Germany to be ready to supply the heat rather than receive it.
Yeah, and there are consultations in the UK for the same as well.
Right. So you're at Reba Stage 2. So Reba Stage 2, you're kind of pre-planning, I guess, with your data centers. So given that the infrastructure of the actual chips for AI is different maybe, and that requires different cooling things, is that leading to a change in the way you actually design the buildings for AI, or
Yes.
is it okay? Tell us about
Yes,
that.
because we are designing our buildings to be AI ready, but
Yeah.
until we have a letter of intent from an end customer, we won't be making that decision on the cooling technology until we've got the right, the end customer on board. 'Cause
Yeah, that makes
ultimately,
sense.
we're not building, let's say, an off the rack. We are
Yeah.
building to suit an end customer's need.
And how does it differ then? How would an AI ready data center differ from a old school data center?
So yeah, you would it would be probably boiled down more to that cooling technology, as I mentioned,
Okay.
right? So if you're going to have an air cooled versus a liquid cooled data center, the infrastructure is completely different.
And the other thing about data centers, which I'm recording, so I worked on data centers in like, I don't know, the early 2000s or whatever it was. They probably were kind of reminiscent of what you see these days, but maybe a little bit more basic. But the other thing that was always really important about them was because we always want to be able to turn on our phone and get to the internet, or computer get to the internet, or stream whenever we want it, they have to be 24/7 operations. And a data center that goes down is a bit of a problem and probably costs somebody a lot of money.
A
So
lot of money.
right. So the other thing that they also have, so they have all the kit in the data hall, they have all the kit to cool it, but they also have something to make sure that if the power goes off, then there's some
Yeah.
way of combating that. So what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And the concept of uptime is one we talk about a lot in data centers, and most maintenance contracts or operations contracts will have a requirement. They have 99.99999 uptime or some stupidly high, which I get for things like, banking, or I'm pretty sure a couple of years ago we had BA halt all their flights in Heathrow because of a data center going
Oh,
down, or
right.
something like that.
Yeah.
So like for aviation, I get that need for the uptime. But if you suddenly couldn't upload your cat videos onto TikTok, that wouldn't be the end of the world, right? So
I think I know some
yeah,
people for which it would be
it
pretty
would
close to
be
Armageddon.
But and that's part, again, last week in this conference we went to, we were having those debates around, so I was actually hosting a roundtable exactly around the resiliency of data centers, and do we need diesel generators, which is usually what
Right.
we have
That's
and
where I was going,
backup.
because I'm
Yeah.
thinking those are going to have to be some pretty meaty diesel generators if we've got that
Yeah.
much power being used.
And they will. And there's a move to HVO, so hydrogenated vegetable oil, I
Yeah.
think it stands
Yeah.
for. So a bio oil run diesel generators. There's a lot of companies committing to that and moving towards that. It's still not the end solution in my mind. And we, yeah, last week we were just debating exactly on that point. And it doesn't necessarily need to, we don't have a technology issue. The technology is there. If we wanted to go hydrogen, but is it going to be green hydrogen? We could just go
Mm.
massive battery banks, but how massive, right? And how, because ultimately it could help. You've got UPSs in place to deal with small blips,
So these are
but
uninterruptible power supplies where,
yes,
if there's a little blip in the power, they'll just support it with generally a bank of batteries, a smaller bank of
yes,
batteries
yes,
for a few minutes or whatever.
exactly. But if you had, a genuine outage
Yeah.
for days, what your diesel generator can do is you can run. Apparently, in the US, the last time it was a Katrina or big hurricane, there were data centers running on diesel generator for weeks.
Yeah. Wow.
Because that's in a sense the beauty of a diesel generator is that as long as you can have fuel coming through, you can keep powering
Yep.
your data center, right, or
Yep.
whatever
Yep.
facility. So there is technology there, but the commercial viability of it at the moment isn't
Mm.
quite there. And ultimately, a lot of the end customers don't seem to be willing to compromise on those SLAs and the 99.99
Yeah. Yeah.
uptime. So there's got to be a convergence of minds in a way for that
Well, let's
to
hope. Let's
shift.
hope there is. Let's hope we can find, because that's great things in terms of the efficiency of the IT kit, great stuff in terms of efficiency of the cooling kit, and then that last kind of resilience piece is an area where it definitely feels like there could be some
Yeah.
mileage to make up in terms of its sustainability. So tell us a bit more about Greenscale's approach to all this, if we haven't said everything already.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've covered a bit of ground, but one of the things we are looking to do, and as part of one of our mission statements, let's say, part of our vision, is that we want to positively contribute to the local communities and the local grids.
Mm.
So the element around the positive impact into local communities is more on the S side of things, but we appreciate we are big facilities that certainly during construction phase will impact the local communities quite a bit, and we don't want to be there just to have like a hotline. If we're disrupting you, just give us a call and we'll try and react. We want to proactively engage with the communities, understand
Okay.
what's important to them, and invest in local infrastructure, invest in, let's say, green space, but not preempt what's important to them. We want to work with them to make sure that they can get something positive out of the work that we're doing, be it through the economy or infrastructure, as I mentioned. But the other side is the positive contribution to the local grid. And this is where I think
Mm.
we could really differentiate ourselves in the market, which is, as we discussed at length, there are so many constraints in the local grid. There are constraints into how much generation we can have on site, but the ability to co-locate with renewable energy generators, battery storage, we can take the pressure off the local grid, but we can also support the local grid at times of need. So making that, be it the battery storage co-located to our site, available to, on fast frequency response,
Mm.
or at any time when the local grid needs to, either for you to take energy away, electricity off, and we can charge our batteries accordingly, or vice versa. We could potentially respond to a time, usually in the winter, when there is a shortage of
Yeah.
electricity, as we are moving away from gas generation and then kind of moving back in, I suppose, at the back of the last energy crisis. Which way are we going? I'm not sure. But yeah, making our data center flexible to those local potential issues with DNOs, DSOs.
Yeah, and they're big enough to actually make a difference, aren't they?
Yeah,
It's not like a supermarket trying to do it. I mean,
absolutely.
this is a whole different scale.
Absolutely. And this is, again, where I find it really exciting. And then I was surprised when I came with data centers that there wasn't more being done in this space, because at my Tesco days, we were playing into demand side response activities as opportunities I just mentioned, but we would need to aggregate several stores together to
Yeah,
really be able to shift the dial and be able to play into those markets, because a store alone, even our biggest stores, wouldn't have enough power flexibly,
yeah,
to make a difference. But whereas a data center,
yeah,
it can make a
absolutely.
big difference.
So what is next then for Greenscale and for you? I guess you're focusing on developing those sites.
Yeah,
What's
and
next?
developing those partnerships, having conversations with potential, battery storage operators, renewable energy developers that can join us in that journey, engaging with those local communities, as I mentioned from day one, and very much still shaping our strategy, right? So I'm currently working on developing our targets and our KPIs,
Mm.
our policies that underpin it all, so that we've got that corporate level commitment and that
And the governance to kind of
roadmap.
yeah,
Absolutely. And
yeah,
all of the reporting, getting ahead of the curve with reporting. So we're looking at setting all of the data ingression processes for reporting against CSRD, although even I don't know if you're following, there's been an omnibus proposal by
mm.
the European Union, which
That
might throw everything.
closed door meeting that they had to
I mean,
yeah.
but so we were and still are planning to, put all of our ducks in a row, so that when we do need to report with CSRD or whatever new legislation comes our way, we are all in the right place, and potentially even
Yeah.
reporting voluntarily in advance. And yeah, getting all of that groundwork which is exciting. I've never had a kind of a blank piece of paper before, and the ability to shape how we're developing the assets and the data acquisition, rather than being in an existing corporate that has kind of grown organically, and then trying to fix
Right.
stuff is
You're
very
trying to
different.
wrestle all those existing processes into
Yeah,
shape and, extract data from places, from bits to the
yeah,
business that don't want to give it to you and all those kinds of
yeah,
things. Well, look,
yeah.
I mean, that's been such an interesting journey into data centers. I think a lot of people won't ever have even really heard of a data center, or certainly won't have understood what it does. So thank you so much for coming on, Anna, and best of luck with everything that's going on at Greenscale.
Thanks for having me. Thank you so much, Kevin. I look forward to hearing all your upcoming podcasts to learn a bit as
Oh,
well.
thank you. Right, I better make them good. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks.